Hello, everyone. This is our working group OLM dev meeting and our community meeting, and it is February 18th, Tuesday. So welcome everyone to the meeting. This is my first time hosting, so don't tase me, bro. But on the agenda, it seems to be pretty light today. The primary thing here is a review of a brief. Um, the brief is for Helm chart support. So, who added this to the agenda?
So it was added to the last week's agenda, and the date is, the due date is, I think, on February 30th.
Mhm.
So it's just a reminder for also people to kind of review the brief. And I think probably Edmund and folks has added it. They are working on it. So if they want to talk about it a little bit, that would be great as well.
Yeah, I
Uh,
think that
I-
would. Go ahead.
Sorry, I was going to ask Igor if you wanted to give us a rundown on that.
Is he on mute?
Who is that, Edmund? Edgar?
Igor, yeah,
Igor,
yeah.
Igor.
Hey,
Okay.
hey, sorry guys. Well, there was some background noise. I've published kind of an initial brief for Helm chart support in OLM v1, and there's been a couple of comments that I so just wanted to discuss those. I'll just put that into the chat. Yeah, I think yeah, Victor, I think that's the one. No, wait a minute. Helm chart product. Okay, so I'm not sure why it's like two different links, but anyways, so in a nutshell, the change that we're proposing here is to have an explicit way for the user to specify that his entry in the catalog is a Helm type entry. And then on the back end, what we do with that is we direct it into a specific engine that just unpacks and applies the Helm chart using conventional Helm libraries. So there's been a couple of comments. The main comment is basically, do we want to explicitly have the users do that, or do we want to automatically detect the type of content from the catalog, and thereby we just save the users from the need to explicitly mention it and make their adoption that much easier. So that's one discussion point. A couple more discussion points are in the comments here by Joe. One more, I think, by Brett as well. So we can discuss those if you're okay with that.
Gavin, are you sharing your screen?
I am not.
Okay, fine.
One moment. Maybe I should do that. Oh. I will do so in a moment, except that Zoom is giving me a little bit of trouble at the moment. Is someone able to share their screen?
I can go ahead and share the screen. It's okay. Happens. Okay. So this was go ahead, Gavin. Sorry.
No. Igor is it's his brief, so I'm interested
Yeah.
in walking through. Go ahead.
Okay, so if you scroll down a little bit, so sorry about that. Okay, so the first comment, it's kind of like a minor comment, but we would like to support multiple ways of getting the Helm chart that's being described in the catalog entry. So the Helm chart can come from just an online Triage. It can come from an OCI registry, can come from a repo in the Helm sense, etc. So we're looking for ways to have that implemented with the guideline being as little effort for the user. And there is an example below, so I'm just going to go ahead and scroll down on that, if you can, please. So if you scroll down a little bit more, because there is more context in the diagram here. So this is like the core of the matter, the piece of code here. This is an example catalog entry. And there's a couple of things going on. First of all is the main attribute here, which is properties type OLM content type Helm. And the main discussion item is if we want this to be on the users, or do we want to actually look at this entry, which is metric server 3.12.2, and just unpack it on the back end and then decide if it's a Helm chart or not. So that's the main discussion item here, and there's a comment by Joe for that. And another minor one, which connects to the previous item we talked about, is the OCI part here, which is, so right now what we have is just a catalog entry looks like image and then just the name of the image and the tag. And here there is an OCI prefix, which indicates that this particular Helm chart image actually comes from an OCI registry. So this is a proposed way of doing things. Like, do we want to do that in a different way? Because we kind of want to have a way to just symbolize where the Helm chart comes from. Just to say like OCI or repo or targz or whatnot. So go ahead, Joe. I see you have your hand up.
Yeah. The thing that I think is probably the most important concept to carry forward still is that a cluster extension, like the API for cluster extension, needs to try to remain format agnostic, right? So like the idea of potentially putting something in the cluster extension API that allows a user to source from a Helm repo directly probably violates that rule, because suddenly now, like, you can't put any arbitrary thing in a Helm repo. You can only put Helm charts in a Helm repo, and now we've got this format specific way to do things. So I know that's not directly talking about this section that we're at, but just in terms of what you're talking about earlier, figuring out like how to source stuff. So in my mind, what I would say that we should do for Helm charts or for anything else in general is that, well, we know we can source from a catalog because a catalog is sort of this way to do indirection, right? So we could have a catalog that has Helm specific transports in it because the catalog could tell us how to do it. Cluster extension wouldn't have to necessarily know the details directly. We could have a direct OCI reference because that isn't any, like, that doesn't really have anything to do with the underlying directory structure of the bundle. So that could be a possibility. And a direct tarball link, that could be a possibility because any bundle could be packed as a tarball potentially. I assume that would be like via HTTP. But I think the one that I would push back on is the Helm repo, because that then gets into the format specific stuff. I'll pause there just to see what folks think about that. Is what I'm saying controversial, or is that aligned with what everyone else thinks we should be doing?
Just to take you back a little bit, Joe. How would you picture a scenario where we have, let's say, a package both as a Helm chart and as an operator, and maybe a user trying to filter which to install between the two?
Is the Helm chart a package just a packaging of the operator? Or is it like an application?
Uh, let's say it's the same thing for this scenario. Let's say it's the same operator, same version,
So
same
we're
name.
saying like there's an OLM registry v1 bundle that packages an operator, and there's also a Helm chart that packages the same operator.
Hmm.
In that case, it would not make sense to me to have both in the catalog. And if you wanted both in the catalog, you'd put them in different packages.
Yeah, and I see the point you're making. However, even today, when we go to our registries, I think we have a number of scenarios where we have multiple vendors publishing the same package, right? And
So, yeah,
I'm
go ahead.
foreseeing
Sorry.
having maybe the same, for example, MySQL. I wouldn't be surprised if we have it as a Helm chart and as an operator, right?
I see. Yeah. So if they're coming from different vendors, um, there's been this long-standing discussion of having a unique identifier that is not just sort of this package name, right? Like if you go look at Helm charts in the wild, lots of different people are probably publishing a MySQL Helm chart. Um, we need to figure out a way to make that easy and possible with catalogs too. And I don't think we have that yet. But in my mind, that's sort of totally orthogonal from adding Helm chart support, because you could have the same exact problem where two different vendors want to publish a registry v1 bundle for the same concept and the same essential for the same app, right? You could have two different MySQL operators potentially. So I think you're right. I think that's a problem that we need to solve. I think it's probably orthogonal to Helm chart versus registry v1 bundle.
I I I don't know if anybody has their hands raised because I haven't from this dashboard. Please go ahead. Otherwise, I have a comment to add.
I think you were up next if Edmund didn't have
Right.
any
Okay.
follow-ups.
So I think so. There are multiple, I think, layers of problems we have to solve. But in general, till now, whatever we have discussed, that Helm would be another type of cluster extension, right? So OLM V1 will help solve everything or anything that is a cluster extension. So differentiating it like as Helm separately is gonna be looks like a long-term problem to us, because then you have to define like, okay, is it registry v1? Then somebody will say, we need more features in registry v1. Then you would have value as registry v2, which you are trying to avoid. But this is mostly theory. When we try to solve some of the problems, we would actually come to know some of the challenges or maybe the limitations to some of the things. But in general, we want to just solve cluster extension, right? And cluster extension is a superset. And then between it, anything which is cloud Kubernetes native should work for our OLM v1.
Jordan?
So I was just wanting to jump in and put a +1 on the idea of keeping the cluster extension as agnostic as possible. Like we're having some chat on the side here where we're talking about what if an extension author decides that they're going to do a version progression and they also want to switch from doing a registry v1 bundle to a Helm chart, and it would be impossible for a cluster extension which is aware of the underlying type to be able to make that pivot. But if, for example, the content type is something that is captured in the underlying catalog structure, in this case, the OLM bundle definition, then we would be able to potentially make that pivot.
I don't think this is maybe
And maybe I'm muddying the waters here. I see your latest comment, Jeff.
well, I guess what I'm thinking is we don't, like, at the end of the day, we go and pull this bundle, whatever it is, and make a file system out of it. And then we start poking around in it and doing stuff with it, right? So if tomorrow we said, oh, we're going to support images that contain Helm chart file systems, we don't have to know in the catalog that it has that, like, because we're going to go and pull it and make a file system out of it. We could add code that just fingerprints that file system and says, ah, I see there's a metadata / annotations file that contains a media type that says registry v1, so therefore I'm going to fingerprint this whole thing as a registry v1 bundle. I don't have to know what this is in advance. In the same way, if I unpack the bundle and I see that there's a chart.yaml in the root, then boom, like that's a chart. I know what to do with that. So I think that we should avoid adding the OLM.content type until we actually, like, if and until we actually need it. And I would argue that we don't need it to differentiate between registry v1 and Helm, so no reason to add it. And it still doesn't preclude what you're talking about, Jordan. Like we could have a registry v1 installed right now. We could go into a resolution, and the resolution code would say, okay, you need to get vx.1. We go pull that bundle. Every time we pull a bundle, we do the fingerprinting. Fingerprinting says this is a Helm chart. Cool. Like let's go and render the manifest for this Helm chart that gives us a plain YAML thing, and we run the renderer. We run the installation for that thing. What maybe gets difficult and is probably something that we need to spend more time and thought and effort on is, like right now, we have this implementation detail where we store revision history of the underlying cluster extensions installation. And right now it's based on Helm, but it doesn't have to be necessarily. If we added a new runtime, if we added Nico's box cutter stuff and we said, okay, we're going to make registry v1 based on box cutter, we'd also have to think about, okay, well, how do we transition from the box cutter's revision history backend to the Helm revision history backend? Or we'd have to say, we're going to have a common revision history backend among all of our format types so that we don't have to worry about this problem. But then that presents other problems. So I think we do have one problem around transitioning to different formats in terms of like having a consistent revision history backend. But I would argue that, I mean, we don't maybe have to implement this initially, but it does seem like it would be nice if you could have a heterogeneous package that contained bundles of different formats. But maybe
I could also see where it might be nice to have a status on the installed cluster extension that identifies the format it's using for the currently installed version too. But that's again a different thing.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I guess the question is, who cares what the format of the bundle is? Clearly, the operator out there cares because they're the ones building it. But do users care?
I don't think a user cares per se, but like one of the challenges that we keep circling, and again, I'm tangenting off here, so maybe somebody needs to lasso me back in, but we've been trying to understand the nature of the underlying stuff that's being installed by users and the ability to, for example, pull a must gather and see the described cluster extension and being able to determine, hey, this particular cluster admin is choosing to use a 60% Helm versus 40% registry v1 might be an interesting data point. So I'm mostly thinking along those lines.
For stats purposes.
Yeah, for determining the use patterns.
Yeah.
For troubleshooting, also do not be helpful. We know when we are trying to solve an issue, we know what is the kind, or what is the type.
I think there's ways to do that and to capture sort of the stats without putting something in our API. We could have logs, we could have metrics. In my mind, the API should be this sort of sacred place that is only ever changed if there's a end user reason to have something in the API.
And you consider the status of the object or the resource on cluster to be part of that API?
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough.
Could it be labels? Do we consider annotations or labels part of the API as well?
Yeah, and I would say that that's even worse than putting it in an actual first class status field because you don't get the same guarantees. It's easier to
So,
accidentally break.
so then you're saying to have this information, it would be some other, you know, side thing that is not on this mainstream if you want this information represented. We have to come up with our own way of logging it
I'm
and
just
hold
saying,
on to it.
let's define what the use case is for exposing that information at all. And once we define what the use cases are, then that'll dictate where we put it.
Makes sense.
But all these things, I think, is outside of the scope of the brief as well, right? Because in the brief, we don't need to cover the status or we don't need to cover the transition from one to another. I think the point that you
Well,
are making is like, let's not change the API without a need.
I think the brief will need to talk about how does this show up the first time? Does it show up in a catalog? Is it a fully separate catalog? Are you allowed to mix things? Like there's all of these implications of we're going to add Helm chart support that go far beyond just the OLM runtime installing a Helm chart or upgrading a Helm chart. Like I think honestly, like that part is relatively easy compared to all of the work that would have to happen in tooling and pipelines and all of the stuff to get to the point that we even have a catalog that has Helm charts that are referenced. That to me is by far the hardest aspect of this.
Would it make sense we say that for us, operator lifecycle manager, we accept it in the same catalog, then it's up to pipelines and who manage the catalogs decide if you add the support or not for other kinds of content as well?
In general, yeah, it would be up to the pipelines to actually implement the support for it, but we would probably need to have very well-defined opinions about what's allowed and what's not allowed, and are there allowed to be mixed content types within a package? And if there are not allowed to be mixed content types within a package, then we would have to put properties on the package so that we could tell that there were mixed content types. So there's sort of like a lot of if this, then that trees to walk through to figure out what we need and where things need to live in APIs.
Would it make sense? Let's see if I understand. Say, like, if, for example, operator lifecycle manage, we get the content, we identify the kind of the content, because it'll be a file system, right? We just transforming whatever we need. We deploy, we update the status, whatever. But how that end up in the catalog, right? That is the tooling part, right? So for example, I have a pipeline that I want to create only a catalog with operators. So in my pipeline, I will check the context and I will not accept it if it's not an operator. If in my pipeline I can do everything, I will accept everything.
I don't think it's going to be I don't think the operator framework group should have an opinion on the contents of the bundle beyond, is this syntactically valid? Like, is this a bundle that if it shows up in a catalog, can OLM do something with it? If the pipeline wants to exert more influence over things, pipeline can go implement whatever influence they want, but that's not really the operator framework's position to have opinions, if that's what you're asking.
Yeah, that is what I was trying to think, right? Because then we keep the scope very, very closely for what we manage, right? We want to manage Helm charts and the bundle V1, right? If we have a catalog with both types, we will be able to deal with both, no matter. But then the tooling part, then it's up to the tooling, right? It's another context, another scope.
Yeah, which has to be included in the scope of this brief, because that's just such a key linchpin for all of this. I think like we've made mistakes in the past where we've sort of put the cart before the horse on implementing new features. And the whole point of Jordan's persona Miro board is so that we can look at a particular feature request and say, yep, this is something we want to do, but this has implications in both directions, right? Like, okay, we're going to have OLM that supports Helm charts. Cool. What does that mean for the cluster extension API and end users, and how are they going to interact with this system? And what are the expectations and what are the limits of what we're going to help support for them? And then on the flip side, like, all right, how do we get to the point that we have this catalog? Do we need some tooling that can generate metadata from Helm charts? Which Helm charts are we going to support? Do we need to? So there's another problem here, which is that Helm charts have this custom OCI artifact packaging format. Does containers image have a way for us to introspect and unpack OCI artifacts that are this Helm chart format? Like that seems like a problem. So there's like all these sort of tentacles that I feel like we need to try to at least understand their existence and accommodate in the brief in terms of like at least calling out, yes, there's a problem here that we need to solve, and there's a problem here that we need to solve, and there's probably like 6 other problems or 10 other problems that we need to solve that are sort of indirectly related to the actual function we're trying to implement.
That is a good point. So one thing that came in my mind when we support another formats, right? Because today in the CSV, we have related images that we can know what are the images usage into the toolings. You'll be able like to mirror the images for the disconnect environment, right?
Yep.
If we support another type, like the Helm charts, how we'll know all images that we need to download from the internet.
Yep. So that's yet another one of the personas on the Miro board that's like every time we see a brief, we need to go to that persona list and be like, all right, how does this impact that persona? And make sure that make sure that we're considering it and that eventually the RFC is going to have an answer for it.
One idea that came in my mind, I don't know if it's silly, right? If what you folks think about that. Maybe it's too much personas, but if we try to put all personas in the template and say that is affected or not, and how like a table, would that something like that would help us?
I think it would, yeah, because it would force us to think about it. And if a reviewer is looking at a brief or an RFC and it looks like the table hasn't been fully populated, it's just at least like a, hey, like I see that persona listed there and I don't see this thing that I would have expected related to what we need to change in order for that persona to be made whole. So just like the reminder for both authors and reviewers of the designs to make this consideration for have we thought about all the personas? So I would agree that it would be good to have that list of personas in the template. And if it truly is, it's not applicable, that's fine. But then there's at least an opportunity to question whether it's applicable or not.
Just wanted to add one point. Camilla, like recently we had a connect with somebody from the OC Mirror. about having something similar like related images for Helm charts. So, and I think Tony was in the call as well. So I think he's gonna converge to some kind of related images for Helm. So I'll just share that issue in the chat. And we've opened an RFP as well for the same.
This is one of those things I think that there's like this way that we should distinguish upstream, what upstream OLM cares about and what downstream OLM cares about. From an upstream standpoint, we don't care if there's related images, right? Like the related images are optional. And the reason I say that is we want to try to support essentially arbitrary Helm charts that exist. And arbitrary Helm charts that exist are not going to have this related image metadata in general. Like maybe there are ways and heuristics we could implement that could help find the related images. But with Helm charts, like it's really hard to know what all of them are. And there's in some cases you just can't know because it's just built into the code. So I don't think I don't think we should have any upstream requirements that related images exist, and we should be able to deal with the fact that a Helm chart doesn't have them at all. And then if there's tooling that is trying to do mirroring of stuff, then we would want that tooling to basically say like, sorry, like we can't mirror this thing because we don't know what its related images are. Or maybe this doesn't have related images, so this is best effort. Like what you see is what you get sort of thing. But I want to just make sure that we don't impose sort of enterprise requirements on the upstream project.
But for the other side as well, Joe, as an upstream solution, right? If we use that in a company or in any place, like I have the project to manage things in a school, right? It's not an enterprise thing, but I want to, as admin, I want to ensure that all will be fine, all will be secure. I don't want to data. I don't want to risk. So probably I also want to mirror everything and to have like a copy of the images in my server.
Yeah, I'm not trying to say we shouldn't do it. I'm trying to say we shouldn't make it required. Like the goal for me is you can hand the tooling that we implement like just close your eyes, throw a dart at the Bitnami Helm chart repo. It lands on a chart. That chart should work in general with OLM. No changes necessary.
No, I get your point, right? It's not a pre-requirement. We support that in upstream, but maybe depends. If we find a nice solution that's not a high effort, maybe could also solve for downstream, right? Maybe just came in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, like if you look at FBC, we have a field upstream called related images. And if it's populated, we carry that metadata along. That seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to continue to do. If we we'll define something that's like, if we see this inside the Helm chart metadata, we'll recognize that as related images and we'll put it in the catalog. But if we don't see it, that's fine too, from OLM's perspective.
Makes sense. Thank you.
One of the other things that I think is going to be something we'll have to consider is that Helm is imperative and users are sort of used to, in many cases, not all cases, but users are sort of used to like, all right, I'm going to do a Helm install command. And I'm going to sit there and watch what happens. And I'll pass some flags to it once that I want it to work a certain way. And then it works or it doesn't. And then I go and figure out what to do next if things didn't work. There are bits of Helm functionality that are not declarative because they're flags to the Helm CLI, not attributes of the chart. So we're going to have this other problem probably where cluster extension admins and or maybe extension authors that are building Helm charts have opinions on which flags we should set when we do installs and upgrades. And that seems like a recipe for like very tight coupling with Helm itself, right? Because like Helm defines its flags, they're very Helm centric. There's no way to decouple that and to make it general, really. So I think we're going to need to think about how, like, should we allow custom flag passing into the runtime that like configures how the runtime works per cluster extension? Um, or do we only accept sort of templating variables as configuration? I know Nico called this out at some point where he was sort of thinking about the fact that there might be both like execution configuration and also templating configuration, and maybe we need to have concepts for both.
Do you mean like, for example, that should be a changing API, right? Like we have like a key map where I can pass the key and the value. And then when we install the Helm chart, we apply all that keys and values. And also we need the same for upgrade, because maybe for install is one set of configurations, and to upgrade it's another.
For the flags that get passed to the install and upgrade commands, yes, that's what I'm talking about. And yes, we probably would need them to be separate for install and upgrade. And that would be all separate from the values that you pass, which would essentially be like the values.yaml. So I would imagine if we are going to try to support that, it would have to come sort of under the hood of our general sort of free form values passing that I think I referenced in this brief that Nico and Pear are working on a separate brief that's just only about how do we pass configuration to the underlying extension. I think Igor, maybe you had your hand up first.
It's either me or Brett. So the initial proposal here was kind of based on what we currently have in OpenShift. So in OpenShift, if you go to the developer view, there is an option to install Helm charts explicitly from a certified Helm repo. So the ability to pass values into the Helm chart is kind of, it's not just part of the API itself, it's also baked into the UI in a way where you can just have the pass key value pairs from the UI itself, and those will be appended into the values YAML. So yeah, it's the major point is, I think, as both you and Camila mentioned, is once we know how to take the input from the user, either in an explicit or kind of an implicit hidden way, then we can just populate a map and pass the map over to the Helm engine on the backend, and the Helm engine knows what to do with it. It knows how to append it into the values YAML, into the values of the Helm chart, right? But the main discussion item here is how do we go about it? Because if we try to do the explicit way, that's an API change to cluster extension, right? Then we need to tell the cluster extension, hey, there is a bunch of key value pairs in this secret or this config map over there, right? That's the way that we implemented it in the proof of concept, right? But that's an API change, and we kind of want to not do that. So
I think that would be like, I think we're going to need an API change in the cluster extension in order to allow passing of arbitrary configuration. So I don't like, not only is that not off the table, I think that's very much on the table. The hard part is you can't make it Helm specific. You've got to make it general enough that we think that it will suffice for all existing registry or all existing supported formats and any future supported formats. So that's where that's why we've got this separate brief in progress, because we're trying to think about it in general. How do we add something to our API that's going to allow passing configuration in an extensible way? And obviously, one of the things we need to accommodate is Helm charts and values.
Makes sense.
Brett?
Yeah. Hey Lala, can you just scroll the no, down a little. I just want to see that comment that no, sorry. Just trying to see the next comment that we were talking about there. Joe's, yeah, that one.
This one and yeah,
Yep.
this one.
Yeah, that one right there. So I was just kind of wondering about, okay, so just working off what you said, Joe, we're trying to come up with a more general way to deal with Helm values. Is that a superset of Helm values essentially? Like, or like, so just in terms of our implementation, we'll be able to use Helm libraries to handle Helm values, and then we're also going to include another way to do values, or I'm just trying to understand that.
Yeah, so what I sort of have in my head is that the cluster extension API will have kind of what Igor was just talking about, where we have a way of setting a secret or a config map or a list of secrets in config maps, or maybe have inlined configuration, which is maybe a blob of arbitrary data, or maybe it's a map string interface, or maybe it's raw JSON. Like we have to decide what is the extensible format for us to just convey arbitrary configuration. And maybe we have to support more than one of those. But once we define what is the API going to look like from the cluster extension standpoint, from there, all we would need to do is make sure that we can translate from whatever that is into Helm chart values or registry v1 template configuration or whatever else we may need.
Is there some stuff from like V0 that like um is there some stuff from V0 that you see as like absolutely essential that Helm doesn't provide?
Well, so for V0, we support registry v1 bundles, and we support a subscription.spec.config, and we support different install modes. So what we're looking at for registry v1 configuration is which namespaces do you want to watch? And let's go and take the subscription.spec.config and make that part of what you can template in a cluster extensions general API blob, right? So the high level idea that I'm working against is the cluster extension has this opaque configuration blob. The cluster extension itself doesn't really look at it, has no idea what the fields in it are. It's just this opaque blob of data. When you figure out which runtime is going to handle this bundle, you pass the whole blob over to the runtime and say, here's what I want to use. Ideally, the runtime would also be able to say, well, I know that this bundle came with a schema for the configuration. So before I do anything with this, I'm going to validate the blob with the schema. And if there's any validation errors, then I'll just stop right there and report an error back up that says, hey, your configuration doesn't meet the schema for what's expected here. Assuming that the validation passes, then the next step would be, cool, well, now the runtime knows how to handle that blob of opaque data. and we can go and do the rest of our templating and continue the process. But if you do it that way, then that means that each runtime gets to decide how to handle that blob. And you still get sort of a decent API guarantee because as long as all the runtimes have access to a schema, you can still validate things. So you don't get it at admission time. You don't get admission time validation, but you get reconcile time validation. Then we basically would, I think, probably implement that in the same sort of conceptual idea as a pre-flight check, although it might happen at a different time.
Okay.
Does that resonate?
Yeah, I think so. I just really trying to get the scope of that thing, that comment.
But are we safe with blobs? Is this a thing that folks do, or is this something that API folks would like more specificity on?
I think ultimately we're going to be like, I can't imagine that we'll be able to be very specific from our cluster extension API standpoint because like Helm says, give me a map, an arbitrary map of stuff that is something that can be represented by JSON or YAML. And then there's a schema that Helm supports where a chart can come with a schema and we can execute the schema against the values and it'll say yay or nay. But you might come up with another bundle format that says, I take TOML configuration. So I need to pass TOML in because that's the only thing that this library knows how to handle from a config format. You might have another thing that's like, I use, like Avro is your example. Like, yeah, we only take Avro configuration, which to me would be crazy, but that's possible, right? Like, so the blob that you have to send into that other runtime is going to have to be a binary Avro blob. That's fine. Like to us, it's just a blob. The underlying runtime that knows about Avro is going to parse that, potentially do the validation, and decide whether it's the right Avro or not, and then keep on going about its business. But I don't think we'll be able to have, at the end of the day, I don't think we'll be able to have any more opinions than arbitrary blob of data needs to be able to be sent across this API. We might also say that there are other ways to represent data if there's something that's a better UX, right? So we could say, we will let you inline your configuration and do it as YAML such that it looks like it's native. And in the back end, if it's convertible to the format that the engine needs, then we can do it. And otherwise, then we'll send an error and say, like, we can't handle this with the engine that is trying to recognize it. So we don't necessarily have to just go with the lowest common denominator. We might be able to selectively do something that's a little nicer.
The pros of the YAML maybe is like when we trying to help someone, we have all data, right, in a format that is easy to see.
Yeah, I mean, and it's easy to implement, right? Like if you're someone that's creating a cluster extension and you need to fill out the configuration, it would be a lot nicer probably if, well, so I think, so here's this other sidebar. I think we basically have to have references to secrets at the very least as a way to convey data because there might be secret data in the configuration. So you don't want to just put that in the cluster extension inlined. But say you don't have any secret data in your configuration, all you want to say is like, give me 3 replicas. It would be much nicer from a UX perspective for pretty much everyone involved if the cluster extension API had a way for you to inline something that said spec.config.inline.replicas:3. Because that looks all very native. But actually under the hood, we'd say, well, actually everything under spec.config.inline is a map string interface or a raw JSON, and we'll parse it that way. and we'll pass the blob off to the runtime. And if the runtime can handle a JSON.raw message, then great, like we're off to the races. But if not, then we'll have to say, sorry, don't know what to do with this.
The part of the config map, the secrets, right? Maybe I'm silly, but I was thinking, if I have a Helm chart and I needed to inform the Helm chart a config map or a secret in these values, I will inform the name only, right? The config map and secret, forgetting operator lifecycle manage. In the values, I will put here is my secret with my password, right? I cannot put the password here. Then the Helm will be the implementation to check that and use as it should use, right? So if
That would
in the
be, yeah, if the chart templating does lookups into other cluster objects, then yeah, we wouldn't know about that or care about it. But if the actual values.yaml and the value schema say there's something in the values YAML that's like, what password do you want to use for the database? The Helm chart's not asking for the secret where the password is. The Helm chart is asking for the password. So in that case, we would ourselves need to be able to let a user put the password in a secret and then have the values loaded from the secret.
interest, I'm trying to think, yeah.
But I think what I would probably say to maybe try to wrap this part of the conversation up is I don't think this brief needs to really touch on the details of any of that. I think it's sort of the other way around where we need to go and do that other brief about how do we do extensible configuration. And we need to make sure that anything that we would want to do as part of the Helm chart support is going to be possible if we go and build the thing that we describe in this other brief around extensible configuration.
More one thing, Joe. In the chat, I put the questions. I think it's mainly less the question that you discussed. Like I suggest if we could change the briefs to be like silly questions in a logical order. Has any question anything that I missed from the points that you spoke? Maybe that can help them.
I think that at a high level covers most of what I'm thinking about. But again, it's like, well, what about disconnected use cases? And what about, I mean, I think there's probably a lot more questions we could ask too, but at a very high level, I think this is a lot of it. I
Thank
think
you.
the other one I think is probably maybe it's sort of under here, but like what are we going, like what are the limits of what we can support? Like going back to the question of can we migrate an existing cluster extension from a registry v1 bundle to a Helm chart as just a normal upgrade? Like we need to think about that too. So Igor, I think what I would say, I don't know if I said this out loud, I put a comment in here on the summary of work section that links over to a brief that I've been sort of drafting for like 6 or 8 months, just as we learn more use cases about the content author UX strategy, where we're essentially trying to think and write down all of the issues that we've encountered in OLM v0, and like the use cases that extension authors and operator authors and admins and all of the people in between have had for OLMV0 and try to say, what are we going to do to fix that and make it so that all of these use cases are much easier to implement and use and maintain. So I would encourage reading over that. It's very drafty, very brief, well, very draft at the moment still. But there's if you scroll down, there's a list of use cases. There it is. So that list of 19 use cases, if you scroll up a little bit, read through that and think about how adding support for Helm charts would affect or impact all these use cases. That might be another good way to think of other things that we need to cover in the Helm chart support brief. And by all means, add comments, especially if there are other use cases that aren't written here. Our challenge is going to be, if you read through these use cases, you'll probably see that some of them are sort of in direct conflict with each other. So our challenge is going to be, how do we deconflict those in a way that makes sense? So if you can think of other use cases to put in here, just even if you think they conflict with what's already here, let's write them down.
All right. I think we're at time. Are we okay? Have we discussed enough?
We usually go through our board. Gavin,
Do we have,
there
do
is
we have time for that?
yeah, we can skip it today. For our next meeting, we can cover that. That's fine. It's not a blocker or anything.
Is there, yeah. If anybody has any questions or wants to discuss what's on our upstream project board, just do it in Slack on the upstream OLM dev channel.
Yeah.
But that was a really good discussion. Thanks for bringing that, Igor.
It was nice. Thank you, folks.
All right. Thank you. I think we conclude our meeting now. See you guys next week. And whoever wants to take over emceeing, feel free to write your name in the template and set up next week's agenda.
Thanks, Gavin.
Yeah,
All
thanks,
right.
everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, Gavin. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.